Before I actually launch into the monitoring piece, I want to make sure that we cover one other piece of context here, and that's that steelhead, as John so well described, is a very complex critter. And there are many factors that contribute to the decline of those fish. And as you can imagine, depending on what strategy you use as a steelhead, whether you're Danny DeVito or the muscle builder, Schwarzenegger, there's many things that can happen to you as you grow up. This is sort of a schematic. It doesn't cover all of the factors of decline, but some of the more important ones. Going counterclockwise, there's unfavorable ocean conditions, climate change. There's overutilization from a commercial standpoint, from a recreation standpoint, and even from a scientific standpoint. We've just heard a bunch of information about habitat restoration. Why are we doing that? It's because we have harmed habitat over the many decades. Predation, there's some discussions about that. Harmful hatchery practices, which is what I'm going to address here in just a minute. Disease, we heard a little bit about that. One that we haven't really talked about today, but I think it's abundantly clear that as much as we try to create regulations that protect fish, that word inadequacy is still true today. We still don't really protect them as well as we can. So there's a lot of different factors that go into whether a steelhead is going to live or a steelhead is going to die. So when we did the SK studies, the only factor of decline that we were looking on was to examine this harmful hatchery practices on Skagit. To do that, don't look at any of the words or anything. This is just a picture, basically, of how we approached evaluating interactions between hatchery and wild steelhead. And we endeavored to look at things from a genetic standpoint in terms of interactions between wild and hatchery fish, but we also looked at ecological interactions. Went through that process, a decision was made to turn the hatchery off. So, again, I guess if I could maybe take one message home today, it would be from this slide right here, which is, you've heard a lot of things about hatcheries today, a lot of which haven't been real favorable. I want to make sure people understand that if all we do is fix that factor of decline, we are not going to recover steelhead in Skagit River or any other watershed in Puget Sound. It's far more complicated. So don't think that this is a silver bullet. I want to underscore that. Okay, finally, I'm getting to what I was asked to come and talk about, but I felt that it was important to give you some context. So, fall of 2014, we formed what was called the Skagit Monitoring. It's made up of Washington Park Fish and Wildlife, the 3 Skagit tribes, and Seattle City Light. A few months later, we put together an effectiveness monitoring plan, which was just completed last month. And that plan has just started to be implemented. I'm going to go through what's in it and why we think it's going to accomplish what we hope. So the purpose of this particular plan is to monitor how the discontinuation of the segregated hatchery is going to affect the ecological, genetic, and the productivity of steelhead in the Skagit River. We are expecting some changes. What are those expected responses? First of all, we're hopefully not going to see any future competition at various life stages, or depending on what strategy the fish takes. There won't be any interactions between wild and hatchery fish in the future. We're also hoping to see a reduction in the genetic hybridization and integration in wild fish. And what I'm referring to in this talk is natural origin steelhead. And hopefully, one area instead of seeing a reduction, we're hoping to see an increase in the survival of wild steelhead in Skagit. This is a calendar. It's actually quite simple. Where you see a black square, that is where we see a big change occur. So for example, in 2014, that is where we saw a complete reduction in the release of hatchery smolts into the Skagit River. So this is where things start to change from an ecological and genetic standpoint. That transfers out ahead to 2 years later, when those adults would have come back if they had been released. This is the first year where we're going to see a lack of sort of the typical hatchery steelhead, true salt fish, will not be coming back to the Skagit in 2016. If there was a hatchery stray that came back into the river and spawned in the wild, you would see that effect in 2018. So in other words, if a hatchery steelhead spawns in the wild with a wild fish, the hybrid juveniles would be smolts here and come back as adults here. That isn't going to happen anymore. So these are also two other time periods where we see the effects of the reduction in hatchery releases. So this is sort of the calendar of expectations in terms of when we see things start to change. So the team, again, I'm just one of the team members. The team went through a pretty long process of trying to come up with some ways to monitor this process in a way that could actually be done from a scientific standpoint. It wasn't the easiest thing in the world to do. We ended up coming up with 3 elements to the monitoring plan. The first one is to look at things from an integration and hybridization standpoint using genetics. We also wanted to look at ecological changes, in this case survival at the smolt life stage, and I'll go into the details of that in a couple of minutes. And then finally, adult abundance. Again, the expectation being that we're going to see some increases over time. So the first element is this one. That's a slide of obviously a caudal fin of a steelhead. We're taking a small snip. Actually, this is a large snip for the picture of DNA off that steelhead. It's used in the genetic parts of the study. So the hypothesis behind the genetic piece of this is that, as you can read here, hybridization and integration will decline at both the population and sub-basin levels following the discontinuation of chambers origin hatchery releases. That's the hypothesis. It's pretty straightforward. This picture depicts the entire Skagit watershed. The monitoring sampling design is going to be spread over a 12-year period. What we decided to do from a genetic standpoint is look at 2 spatial levels. One being the population, the entire population of Skagit River together as a composite. The other to look at subbasins. Every place you see a color, like this is the Sual River subbasin. We want to also look at things from the subbasin level to see what sort of changes might occur. And the simple approach would have been to maybe look at one life stage to see how the genetics change at a particular life stage. We chose to look at 3 life stages. We're looking at young of the year. So in an earlier talk, where it was now, was saying how important it is to look at young of the year. That's where if you're going to see the effects of hybridization and integration, it's most pronounced at the young of the year level. We're also going to be looking at smolts and adults. So this is just a quick three examples of how we're going to accomplish this. So at the basin level, for example, we're going to be collecting steelhead smolts at the Mount Vernon Trap. So Mount Vernon Trap is near the base of the watershed. It's collecting fish from the entire basin. We actually, as we're speaking today, that trap is working. We're probably taking a couple of steelhead smolt samples that will be used in this study. But the composite of smolts that will be taken this year and for the next 12 years will be used in a comparative way. Likewise, at the basin level, the Upper Skagit tribe is using a tangle net to collect adults and release them after they take genetic samples and scales. And they'll be doing that for the next 12 years. So we're looking at both the adults and smolts at a basin level. Similar approach here, looking at sub-basin level, on the Upper Skagit, Sauk, Cascade, Finney Creek. Those are the four sub-basins that we're going to be evaluating. The only major difference between the four is on the Cascade. You'll notice that even though it's a sub-basin approach, we're not going to be looking at adults or smolts just young in the year. And you heard Bill this morning talk about the difficulty we had trying to sample adults in the Cascade River. After a fair amount of thought, we realized that trying to get a sample, a statistic sample, from the Cascade for 12 years in a row, impossible. So we're only going to be looking at young in the year in the Cascade. The other sub-basins will be looking at both smolts, at adults and young in the year. And then finally, because of some of the work being done again by the state and the tribes, Ed showed some of the tributary traps. There's two that are functioning this year on Hanson Creek and on Lavin Creek. We're going to be collecting smolts from those traps, hopefully for the next 12 years if those smolt traps continue to operate that long. So that's how we're going to be doing our sampling. This, and I again want to underscore this a little bit. This is a schematic. It's theoretical. The axes and what I'm calling the level of hybridization is meaningless, other than 0 means 0 and 9 means the most you can get.
No units.
Exactly. So please don't take it any further. This is just for example purposes. Each line, I'll finish the graph first. So the first point on the x-axis is the baseline hybridization level. So this is before the hatchery was turned off. We have a baseline level of hybridization and integration. And you can see that I've represented it as being at different levels on the four different areas that we're looking at. Each of these lines represents either a different basin or a different composite. I think one of these is the Skagit Basin adult life stage. So this is a composite of the entire basin in this orange line. And this is just to depict one possible outcome scenario that you might expect. Again, our hypothesis is that the levels are going to be reduced over time. So this is baseline level. This is 10 years down the line. You can see in this scenario that I'm assuming that we'll see some reductions. But as you can see, not all the lines are doing the same thing. This is a second scenario. Same thing. This is another possible outcome, which is we still start at the same baseline level of integration and hybridization. And after 10 years, we see no change. I'm not expecting that, but again, just to be fair, I want to explain that whatever analysis we choose to use will yield results that we'll have to interpret. Even though we're expecting to see reductions, there's some other things that I think are gained here that we use not only within the Skagit, but in decision making elsewhere, whether it's in Puget Sound or in other streams out on the coast. Here's an example of that. I left two of the sites up here. The orange is the Upper Skagit adult, Finney Creek adult in blue, and the difference being that as the experiment starts, we have our baseline level, and on the Finney Creek population, after 3 years, we see no change. On the Upper Skagit, there's immediate drop. So the only difference between those two is location, size of stream, and categorized in other ways. But I'm not expecting to see the same reaction to this experiment everywhere in the basin. And I think it'll be interesting to see where it starts occurring first and how far it goes, how much of a reduction we're going to see. It's actually really exciting to think about that. So as an extension to the previous slide, these are some other things that I think we might be able to mine from the data. First of all, when we get away from the cartoon that I just used here as a theoretical example, we'll actually be able to hopefully define what the relative levels of introgression are with a really high degree of certainty. We'll be able to discover when the changes occur, both spatially and temporally. And then another part of this is what I call persistence. Maybe some parts of the basin where it's going to take longer to see a reduction. Can't explain exactly why now, but it's possible. And then there's also the rate of change. We may see some instant reactions in some parts of the basin, other places. It may take a while before we really see any changes. Again, it's just a grand experiment. So now we're moving into the second piece of the monitoring effort. This is Ecological part, and this has to do with survival. Survival at the smolt stage. And this one might surprise people a little bit. So that's not a great white shark, but it might as well be in the Skagit River. That's an adult bull trout. You usually don't see them like that. This one is under some anesthesia, and it's just a little wobbly right now. But I think for any of you that have fished bull trout know how aggressive they are. The simmers, they eat fish, and do it very effectively. So when you have a hatchery that predictably releases 250,000 to 500,000 smolts each year, these bull trout have a brain for that, and they kind of know where to be, whether it's in the estuary sometimes of the year, in the Skagit other times of the year, because in the case of the hatchery, it's like a 24-hour den. It's always open. You can use as much as you want. So we're going to try and evaluate the predator-prey relationship that has been established over decades. And these hatcheries have been in operation for nearly 60 years, and these bull trout have developed kind of an understanding of how it operates. So this is this picture. These are not steelhead. This picture kind of illustrates what we're going to be doing. So when you have a predator, especially a key predator that's so numerous, I mean, I've heard Kurt talk about bull trout more times than I care to mention in the Skagit. It's probably the premier bull trout population in the United States. That's in the Skagit. I think I've heard you throw out numbers like 30 or 40,000 fish, if my memory serves me correct.
Oh, I think the adult spawning population is around 10 grand.
Yeah.
Yes. We want to talk some adult fish, first year return from the salt, something in the 30, 40,000 range is probably possible.
So whether it's 10,000 or 40,000, it's a lot of predators in the Skagit River. And what we're hoping to do is find out how bull trout are going to react to this turning the faucet off of hatchery smolts. It's a prey that they've exploited for a number of years. And the reason we know that is that we funded a graduate student to do a bioenergetic study of bull trout in the Skagit River. And what he found out is that during the spring, when the smolts are present in the upper Skagit River, 56% of their diet is composed of steelhead. So we're hypothesizing that the discontinuation of the hatchery plan in the Skagit River will alter foraging behavior of bull trout, and it'll also change the relative vulnerability of steelhead to predation. So the vulnerability of steelhead to predation is what we're keying in on. And the way we're going to be doing that, by the way, this is a picture of a young steelhead juvenile that came out of a bull trout, obviously partially digested. I think you can clearly see the colors and patterns on this that identify it as such. Where we're going to be doing this, starting this year and next year, we're going to be trying to capture 30 to 60 bull trout, pump their stomachs during the springtime when there would typically be some hatchery smolts in the vicinity to see how the proportion of steelhead changes in their diet in those 2 years. And depending on the outcome of that, it may extend further. So this is the last element of our monitoring program. And again, I don't have any results for you, but I can explain a little bit more about this with a couple of slides. Bill talked about the Keogh River in his presentation this morning. And in doing our SK work, we realized with some work that Ed Connor completed that the Keogh wild adults and the Skagit wild adults seem to be in the same pattern. When the population in the Keogh goes up, so does the Skagit. When it goes down, so does the Skagit. I'll give you an example of that. So here's a graphic that was actually in the SK report. And what you're looking at on the x-axis is the adult return, and the adult return on the Skagit, and the Keogh is on the x-axis. And the way you look at that is that when you have low returns in the Skagit, which is this quadrant of points, the same thing happens on the Keogh River. Likewise, when you have higher returns on the Skagit, the same thing happens on the Keogh. So in a real simplistic way, through this illustration, our hypothesis is that there could be some incremental increases in Skagit returns as a result of this experiment that we're doing with the removal of hatchery smolts in the Skagit River. What that would look like, and again, this is just a cartoon for illustration purposes, is this black line is real. This red trend line and the red dots I created to illustrate this point is that if we do see increases and they are measurable, it could look very much like this, and that this line is going to shift up because the Skagit will have higher adult productivity. That would be the expected outcome. If we're not right, then that's what it's going to look like. No change. So this brings us full circle back to the one point I haven't talked about, which is future. So again, this is a 12-year experiment, which is, I mean, that's a large part of anyone's life. It'll go beyond probably my involvement in that. But what I think everyone hopes is that we get some results from this work that can help us not only better manage the Skagit from a steelhead standpoint, but other watersheds, whether on the Olympic Peninsula or in Oregon or elsewhere in Puget Sound. And I hope that would be the case. And then finally, I had to sort of put my little pitch in here. Again, another third take-home message for you. Because I know the Alliance, for example, is really interested in the Skagit. They want to see steelhead do well in the future. And I know Steve walked out here, but people that work on the Skagit as professionals we don't really get the word out as much as we probably should about all the good things that are actually happening up there. We just heard Steve talk about probably 25 projects you never heard of before today. What I wanted to reinforce is that there has been a lot of hard work done on Skagit in regards to steelhead. Research, restoration, harvest management, monitoring, recovery planning. Ed is going to talk about recovery planning after me. But just to mention a couple in there, this list is a lot longer. There was the SK study that was done recently, a yearling study, which was a huge study on the Skagit River that we learned greatly from and will help us with recovery. Jamie Thompson, who I'm sure John is well aware of because of some of the work that he's done on the different life history strategies that steelhead are taking in the Skagit River. Mara Zimmerman just published a paper with Ed and I, which came up with some really interesting concepts. And then you just heard talk about the Puget Sound marine survival. Those are just a few of the things that are being done on the Skagit. Restoration. You just heard Steve talk about restoration projects on the Skagit. He's only talking about what the tribes do. There's a larger neighborhood that's represented by the Watershed Council that's doing even more than that and has been for the last 15 or 16 years. Harvest management. We didn't really get into this very much, and I just want to throw some carrots out there. One of which is, it was mentioned, I forget by who earlier today, closures of rainbow trout harvest on tributaries in the Skagit River. There's one thing that we've found out over the years is that when you catch a rainbow trout in Finney Creek or in Hanson Creek, you're not catching a rainbow trout, you're catching a juvenile steelhead. And for years, people have been harvesting juvenile steelhead in all these tributaries. And by just closing those tributaries off to harvest, we are going to see recovery in those tributaries. It's inevitable. It will happen. Wild fish release. That was one of the better things I think the state's done is you got to release wild fish. That especially is going to help the early returning fish that used to be harvested in November, December, January. And then finally, tribal conservation. Despite what many people think, the tribes are, in the Skagit especially, are responsible for making the decision to cut back on what they are harvesting to almost nothing. And they don't have to do that. They're doing it because they're trying to conserve. And I just want to make sure that people understand that. I just talked about monitoring. Pretty excited about that. Ed's going to talk about the recovery planning. Final comment. Current levels of decline took many, many decades, as Bill and others have pointed out today. And it's not something you turn around instantly. It is going to take time. It's going to take persistence. It's going to take good science. And it's going to take good decision making and working as a collective like this. So that's what I have.